Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are back here with Sarah Lohman for Food History Horror Stories. And we're very excited that you could join us. I just wanted to take up just a little bit of your time for a few upcoming program announcements real quick. On Friday, October 21st at 1 p.m., we are hosting Callan Bignoli, and she's going to talk to us about who is most impacted by banned books as part of our Compelling Questions series. And then on Monday, we have the third in our mindfulness and meditation workshops with Lauren Massey. If you register for the one, if you haven't been to one already and you register for October 24th, I will send you the recordings for the previous two as well. Just a half an hour long, starting at 7:30 p.m. Then our spooky season programming continues with a virtual event with Robert Oakes about the ghosts of the Berkshires. That's going to be on Thursday, October 27th at 7 p.m. Our Watch It Wednesdays series continues with a screening of The Farewell, and that'll be hosted by members of the Chelmsford Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. On Wednesday, November 2nd, we'll celebrate fall with a Drawing Fall Landscapes workshop with Corinne Roberts, and that's virtual as well. And then Sarah Lohman will be back with us on Thursday, November 17th at 7 p.m. to talk about pie. And it's perfect timing for that, for sure. But tonight, another perfectly timed program, I think. Sarah Lohman is presenting Food History Horror Stories, Witches, Poisoners, and Puritans. Sarah Lohman is the author of 8 Flavors, The Untold Story of American Cuisine. Released in 2016 with Simon & Schuster, 8 Flavors is a #1 bestseller on Amazon. The Atlantic called the book richly researched, intriguing, and cleverly written. And a few of us here at the library have read it, and we really like it and definitely recommend it. It's available through the library. Formerly the curator of food programming at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, she has lectured at hundreds of universities and institutions nationwide, including the Museum of Science Boston and the American Museum of Natural History, and the New York Public Library. Tonight, again, food history horror stories. Awesome. Lean into the macabre with 3 scary stories from food history. Sarah will investigate the fungus that many scholars believe caused the Salem witch trials just up the street, how brewers became the archetype for classic witches, and when women murder, why they choose poison, along with stories of some of the most infamous poisoners of the 19th century. I thank you all so much for joining us tonight. If you have questions, and I hope you do, please send them to the chat. And thank you so much, Sarah.
Hi, everybody. I am so thrilled to be back at my favorite library, definitely in America, probably the world. I always really love talking to you. If you haven't been with me before, you just got the lowdown. My book is available at your library, but tonight we're going to talk about food history, but something that is not at all in the book, just like kind of a strange topic, a couple strange topics that I wanted to research. We're going to get a little spooky. We're going to get a little feminist history, and Jess said 3 different stories. We're actually going to do this in 2 acts tonight, since we only have about 45 minutes together, a little bit longer. So I just trimmed out a little bit of something, but we're still going to get some witches. We're going to get witches and female poisoners. As always, I've got my chat box open. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat at any time. Of course, we'll do an official Q&A at the end. But yeah, live transcripts should have just been turned on. Oh, you want it to be savable. Okay, Jess will help you out with that. So please feel free to drop questions either in there or in the Q&A, which I can see all are very adept at using. So let's get started with a story about witches. So first of all right, I'm going to throw this in here, but just briefly, it's just too interesting to ignore. The emblems and symbols that we associate with the classic image of a witch today is actually an alewife, a female brewer from the Middle Ages. Alewives would wear tall hats when they sold their beer at markets. They, of course, had big cauldrons to which to boil the wort for making beer. Since they kept a lot of grain in their homes, they often had cats to keep the mice population down. And then generally these women were older and widowed, or spinsters, unmarried women, who were making beer as a way to support their household. beer making, brewing was traditionally a female act, in that like men are out hunting and farming, and women are at home processing the foods. So it only switched really to a male occupation in the 1500s. And in that time, since men wanted to take over the brewing industry and make it a guild industry and take it out of the homes of the alewives, one of the tactics they used was to villainize these alewives and use all of the symbols of their life to associate them with witches. They basically began using like drawings of female brewers and like using those as like, well, this is what a witch looks like. Tall hat, I mentioned, if they were selling in public at a market, they would wear a really tall hat so that you could see them over the crowd. But then if they were selling beer out of their home, they would actually hang a broom above the door to let the neighborhood know when the beer was ready to sell. So if you decide to dress up as a witch this Halloween, just tell people you're not a witch, you're actually an alewife. And if you are at home and hosting for trick-or-treaters, drop maybe a can of beer in the adults' bags. You don't know. So we're going to talk about another story of witches, and it has to do with the very real consequences of accusing someone of being a witch in the Middle Ages in Europe and up through the late 17th century in America. Particularly, we're going to focus on the Salem witch trials and talk about some of the things that led up to this really horrific moment in American history. And in particular, we're going to analyze a theory that has to do with the food that people in Salem were eating, and also the food that people in Europe were eating during spikes in witch accusations. So the story really begins with rye. Rye grows really easily. It is a very vigorous grain. That's compared to something like wheat. Wheat is actually pretty fussy and hard to grow. And in particular, it doesn't do well in cold, wet climates like rye does. So we see rye as the prominent grain, basically in like the Alps region of France and Germany in particular. You're probably familiar with the famous pumpernickel bread that comes out of Germany. That really dark brown bread, that is a rye grain bread. And actually the name for pumpernickel translates to devil's fart, which is pretty spectacular. So this was a type of grain that was grown primarily in cold, wet regions. Also in Europe, it tended to be grown in areas that were somewhat impoverished. But of course, there was also a very, very slim ruling class and a lot of people who were working within the feudal system on lower levels. So a lot of people were consuming rye as their primary grain. Some people made sourdough-based breads, and some people would get their yeast from the bottom of brewing kegs, essentially. Those were called emptins. Those were the two ways primarily that bread was made, and that's going to be important. Now, a thing about rye is that it tends to get this fungus called ergot. Now, ergot is these black fungal bodies you see here, and it actually replaces the rye grain, okay? And this ergot can actually affect any grass. I found ergot on an ornamental dune grass planting when I lived in Cleveland a few years ago, and it had been a particularly like cold and wet spring, followed then by a really hot summer. And those are the conditions under which this particular grain thrives. Now, there are other sort of grass funguses that are safe or even delicious. Huitlacoche, if any of you might be familiar with it from Mexican cuisine, is a mushroom that takes over corn kernels and like basically grows in place of the grain. And it's considered a delicacy in Mexico and is finally making its way more northward and becoming a part of Mexican American cuisine. Ergot is kind of the same principle in that it is this fungus that replaces the grain. However, ergot is not at all fun. So this is what it looks like when it is fruiting and putting more spores out there. And this happens particularly, as I mentioned, during years that are really, really cold and wet in the spring, followed by a really, really hot summer. Those are the conditions in which any kind of fungus or mold can really thrive. When you consume ergot, it causes a condition called ergotism. So the thing about ergot is that it has some alkaloids in it. One of the primary one being iserogene. An isurogene is really similar in molecular composition to the hallucinogen in LSD. Okay. It's not exactly the same, and that's a key difference. When you drop acid, I assume I never have, you have a good trip, or you can sometimes have a bad trip. With ergot, you never have a good trip. It is always a really bad situation. Now, the exact sort of manifestation of ergot poisoning from these alkaloids changes depending on what alkaloids, what combination of alkaloids, and in what concentration are in the ergot. And that depends on the region, the type of soil, the type of grain, the time of year, a lot of different things. Um, Ergot is so common in rye that up until the mid 18th century, people actually thought that it was a part of the rye plant. So ergot poisoning is very easily avoided today because we know that the ergot is poisonous and it's simply removed from the grain. But historically, when it was thought to just be a type of rye grain, the whole lot was all ground up together and then consumed by the community. Now, when you grind up ergot, it takes 2 years for it to basically dilute by 50%, to be 50% as effective. So these alkaloids stay potent for a very, very long time. And just eating some ergot poison bread, you won't really have much reaction the first time, but it is cumulative. It stays in your system. So there's two types of ergotism. One is known as gangrenous, and one of the effects of the ergot alkaloids on your body is that it constricts your blood vessels. Listen, if you didn't expect we were going to get anything to gross tonight, like you came to the wrong talk. So in these extreme cases in the Middle Ages in Europe, and actually not that long ago, there were gangrenous ergot outbreaks in Ethiopia in the 1980s and most recently in 2001. The blood vessels of the extremities are constricted. And since these areas, the fingers, the toes, and eventually the hands and feet aren't getting any blood flow, they essentially suffocate, the tissue dies, and the limbs begin to rot and then fall off. So we have mentions of this from the Middle Ages. The first case is mentioned in 1847. Nope, 847, so in the middle of the 9th century, is the first case that we can identify as gangrenous ergot poisoning. And then during a gangrenous ergot outbreak in 944 in France, it actually killed 40,000 people. So this could be really, really deadly. And in one sense, there's no cure for it. The cure is to stop eating the poisonous bread. But if you don't know that the bread is the cause of your condition, then you wouldn't stop eating it. The other type of ergotism is called convulsive ergotism. So it happens for some of the same reasons, but again, like the constriction of blood vessels causes sensations on your skin that I'll get into a little bit, into the point where it's causing involuntary muscular contractions. But there are a pretty wide range of symptoms that can occur with convulsive ergotism poisoning. I'm going to read you some examples. So convulsive ergotism is characterized by a number of symptoms. These include crawling sensations in the skin, tingling in the fingers, vertigo, tinnitus, headaches, disturbances in sensation, hallucination, painful muscular contractions leading to epileptic-like convulsions, vomiting, and diarrhea. Basically, the involuntary muscular fibers in the gastric and intestinal tract can also convulse and cause extreme cramping too. And there are mental disturbances such as mania, melancholia, psychosis, and delirium. One from another source, other descriptions, a lot of this is coming, there's muscle constriction involved, but also the ergot alkaloids, they interfere with dopamine production. So a interference with dopamine production is what can result in things as widely ranging as melancholia and psychosis, but also dopamine related conditions are also some of the root causes of epileptic convulsions. So when you don't have enough dopamine, you're going to have muscle spasms, delusions, hallucinations, again, unpleasant mental disturbances, mental aberrations, a feeling of burning skin or insects crawling under the skin. And interestingly, it really seemed to affect women. Women who were poisoned with ergot frequently miscarried. And fertility was generally reduced during these outbreaks too. Hi, Cindy. I'm a maternity nurse and I've used ergot to reduce bleeding after having a baby by causing a narrowing of the blood vessels. Yeah, that's one of the fascinating parts about this is like most sort of chemicals, and in this case, alkaloids out there, it can have practical medical uses. I know for a while too, it was being investigated as a migraine cure because of that ability to constrict to those to dilate those blood vessels too. So that's so interesting that it is still being used in some ways as well. You can see what happens when you have too much of it as well. So we're going to talk about two researchers, and I don't have the links to the papers handy, but Jess might be able to grab them. So we're going to talk about two papers that link ergot poisoning to the incidence of witch accusations, both in Europe and America. And the first paper that came out that basically pitched this theory was by a woman named Linda Caporio, and her paper came out in 1976. And then the research was backed up by another researcher, Matosian, and Matosian's paper came out in 1988. And those are both readable for free online with a little bit of Googling. So one of the things that Matosian points out in her paper is that we see most witch trials occurring and witch accusations occurring in the 15th through the 16th centuries, with, again, Salem witch trials at the end of the 17th century being really, really late in the whole thing. Thanks, Jess. That was so fast. So this is giving you a sense of how the temperature of the world has changed over time. Now, we don't show the 20th century because, as we know, the temperature has skyrocketed in the past 20 to 40 years. But between the 1400 until the end of the 19th century, we were going through what was known as a little ice age. And so the winters were very, very cold. The springs were cold and wet. And then often there were heat waves over the summer. Matosian points out that most witch accusations were happening basically after this global cooling, which created climatic conditions that promoted the growth of fungus like ergot. In the Middle Ages, the convulsive form of ergotism was largely referred to as holy fire or St. Anthony's fire, because when you didn't have any medical explanation for it, especially in Catholicism, God and the devil and demons are very real things, right? So in the Middle Ages, this was thought to be some sort of demonic possession and you were being tormented by demons. Or a little bit later, it was thought to be bewitchment, in that there was a witch nearby and they were messing with you. So if you start behaving this way, all we got to do is look around for the witch to find it out. Sorry, I've got a cat coming through just off screen. I don't know what he wants to do. I'm worried he's going to knock everything asunder. Okay. Sorry. So I mentioned too that if you didn't know that the ergot grains were harmful for you, then you weren't going to remove them from your rye. You probably heard exactly what I feared was going to happening. Well, he just knocked the light over and I know you can still see me, so I'm apologizing. My light isn't perfect. We can deal with that. Anyway, strangely, when ergot is ground up, it creates this reddish purplish color. So when it affects a light grain, thanks, Kathy. Living with cats, what can you do? When it's ground up with a light colored grain, like a wheat, it actually turns the bread reddish pink. And interestingly, historically, one of the traits of witches was that they would have these feasts and they would dine off of bread that was made with blood. And I think that's an interesting connection to the fact that wheat bread with ergot actually looks red. But again, if rye is a really dark grain when it's ground and it's baked, so you wouldn't necessarily see the change in color that the ergot brings about. And you also wouldn't necessarily have an alternative food source too, so you would just go on eating what you had. And I mentioned the two distinctions with how the bread was leavened: a sourdough where you're essentially catching yeast out of the air versus a beer emptins, like the leavings of beer yeast. If you lived in a region where you made sourdough, ergot was not common because the acids produced to make the sourdough were strong enough to kill off ergot and the microorganisms. but not if you're using a beer-based bread. Additionally, ergot seems to affect generally young people between the ages. In one more recent outbreak, about 80% of the victims were between the ages of 4 and 40. And it tends to disproportionately affect women. That's kind of unknown why. It does tend to disproportionately affect children because they are eating more, in this case, ergot infected bread for their body weight. But it does also seem to affect people that have ulcers because it's kind of like a super highway into your bloodstream. We talked about this. Okay. So let's bring it to America with the Salem witch trials. So basically, Matosian says that in Europe, she looked at the data, she looked at the known weather data, she looked at spikes in witch accusations, and she was able to link the cold, wet springs and that would result in the production of ergot in areas where rye was grown with spikes in witch accusations. So what happens? Yes, I managed to throw my papers around. This cat, y'all, I don't even know where the other one went. Okay, that's all right. So this basically starts. I'm so sorry. I need my notes. Hang on one second. I'm just going to put the camera off. What a disaster. It was under my chair. I got it. Oh my gosh. Okay. So the beginning of these witch trials in Salem is in 1692. Now, for the 2 seasons before that, this area of what is today Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, had really cold, wet springs, okay? The whole event starts in February of 1692 when Betty Paris, her cousin Abigail Williams, and a younger servant in the household all begin to have fits that one of the ministers in the area described as beyond the power of epileptic fits or natural diseases to affect. So basically saying this is unnatural, that this is what he thinks is a possession. Additionally, a local doctor took down what was happening during these 3 young women's fits. I should imagine they were like age 9, 11, and 14. He said the girls screamed, threw things about the room, uttered strange sounds, crawled under furniture, and contorted themselves into peculiar positions. Yeah. Girls also complained of being pinched and pricked with pins. So looking at that through the lens that we have of ergotism, we see a lot of similarities in those symptoms, especially the fact that they're having these convulsive fits. They are basically manic. They are later on, they talk about seeing things, whether it's demons floating above their bed, particular people, black cats coming to haunt them. And especially the being pinched or pricked with pins. That refers to those crawling, prickling sensations that a lot of people feel when they have this convulsive ergotism poisoning. So interestingly, the Salem witch trials is the most famous incident, but on other years where the weather had the same conditions, people in Salem reported to have seen visions at religious revivals or have fits of what was generally referred to as nervous fever that included convulsions and in some cases killed 33 people. So it does seem to indicate, I mean, we know that ergot was both in Europe and in the Americas. And so it seems to indicate that it was common in New England, a cold, damp place where originally they were growing a lot of rye. And especially for people who were more poor, that is what they were consuming. Now, generally, the things that contributed to, what became about a dozen young women accusing people in the whole area of being witches, first and foremost attributed to the fact that teenagers are hysterical and they want attention. That is still the most popular, I want to put in air quotes, theory that's put out there, that this is all these young girls' fault. They wanted attention, they liked it, they were hysterical, da 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 da. One of the ways that theory falls apart for me is that all of these grown men in the room could have ignored them. But instead they followed through and arrested and killed dozens of witches. So not buying it, don't blame the girls. They weren't the authority figures. Like, you could have done something about it. Other people have said that perhaps the girls were pressured and manipulated in that the prominent families of the area, including the Parises, of which the first two girls were a member of that family and the servant was in the same household, thought maybe they could pressure these young women to do different like land grabs, that it was a political thing. It definitely was also a social thing because when it's determined by local ministers and doctors that this is a bewitchment, they are asked to name who is bewitching them. And the girls name basically the three outsiders of the community. Tituba, who was an indigenous woman from the Caribbean who was enslaved to one of the families. So she was very outside. She was very much an outsider in this community and had her own sets of religious beliefs that were being interpreted as witchcraft. There was also Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. I don't remember which Sarah is which Sarah, I'm sorry, but one of them was quite an elderly woman who really relied on charitable donations to get by. And she was sort of seen, though, by this puritanical community as like a nuisance and a beggar. And the other Sarah was an older woman who married a man that was 20 years younger than her. And although they seemed quite happy, the community didn't like that. So the first three accused and murdered were really the female outsiders of this very male dominant community. It was mostly women accused. Of course, famously, Giles Corey, a man, was also accused. He was the only death during this incident that wasn't hung. He was crushed under rocks where they were trying to get him to confess. And actually, Kathy, Tituba did survive. We don't know a lot about her after this point, but she sat in prison really for a full year and then was released and got out of there. I think the people she was enslaved to were dead at that point. There is, I'll put it on Jess. There's a great book about the Salem witch trials. Don't remember the name of it. I have to look it up in my Libby app on my phone. And there's also some great podcasts about it too that can give you the full overview outside of the microcosm that I'm focusing on. And so in general, I don't think we can say that, all of the clearly to create something this horrific, a lot of different things would have had to come together. But I think it's rather interesting to propose the idea that what if the fear and everything that happened after was actually grounded in something very, very real, this ergotism and this ergot poisoning. The families that were afflicted tended to have fields that were sort of in lower, damper areas where there would have been more ergot. And so that was sort of the argument of like why it didn't affect every household. And then, of course, we have age, we have ulcers, we have other things that are affecting it. So I think it's a really fascinating theory. The symptoms we already went through. So the other thing that sort of backs up the ergot poisoning theory is that this whole thing started in February of 1692, as I mentioned. Basically, the rye harvest would have been brought in November. So November, December, January, they're eating it. The alkaloids are building up in these little girls' bodies. And that it ends really abruptly in November of the next year, basically after the new harvest of rye had been brought in, after a summer of drought. So you didn't have those wet conditions that promoted the fungal growth. So that's something else that's looked at to say like, well, why did it end so suddenly? Well, maybe people weren't eating poison bread. And of course, we're not just talking about the girls who are afflicted and making the accusations, but something has to be going on to make an entire community believe that this is real and happening, if that is in fact what happened. So it's been described as almost a communal hallucination, which certainly could be brought about by ergotism as well. This is, I'm sorry, so gross, but here it is in the modern era. Ergot is still very much out there. I actually found, like I mentioned, in Cleveland, and of course collected because I'm me, ergot just growing around. If you see it, you should not touch it with your bare skin. You should definitely not eat it. I've had people joke about like, oh man, should eat it and hallucinate. Do not. Like, do you want to feel bewitched? Is that fun for you? It's not fun for anyone. Please don't. So that is my, that's the last I have to say about that. Hi, David, or M. David. Did the other type of ergotism also appear during the same time as the witch trials? You mean in the Salem area? No, that's been reported. Generally, when an outbreak would happen, whether we're talking about here, America, or Ethiopia, it's usually one or the other. And that seems to be connected with like what type of alkaloids are present in this particular batch of rye or whatever other grain. I think actually in Ethiopia it was probably sorghum. And then certainly it would affect wheat, but like when you've got pink bread, people would generally think it was bewitched and throw it away. So it also wasn't until I mentioned the mid 18th century when a botanist figured out what the ergot grain was. And then from that point, things were pretty much okay because farmers were just instructed to pick it out of the grain before it was ground. Diana says a judge in Boston also put it to an end before more accused witches were hanged. Yeah, there was definitely this moment where, I mean, it's just such a crazy thing that happened where someone finally said, this is ridiculous. You need to stop. And there's so many questions about how does a community get to this point, which is why poisoning is an interesting theory. I encourage you to read the papers. They're both very readable. There's also a rebuttal. I cannot remember the two gentlemen's name that composed the rebuttal. The rebuttal was essentially, but teenagers are hysterical. It was not a good rebuttal. I've never actually seen like a really good rebuttal to the very clear facts that these two women put out. Are there any other questions at this point before we move to Act 2 of our spooky food stories? Ooh, it's 4:30, running right on time. Sorry, it's 7:30. I live on the West Coast. Thank you, Margaret. Margaret says, this is interesting. All right, so let's talk about historical female poisoners. And if you do have any more questions, use the Q&A or use the chat. So again, this is just a topic that like the ergotism I kind of heard about, and I just wanted an excuse to do a deep dive, actually read these papers, see if there's anything there. Female poisoners, I mean, true crime is big right now, but I will say that like true crime was also huge historically. This is the front page of the Police News, which was a penny dreadful. And penny dreadfuls were essentially this, very cheap newspapers that like reported on probably half made up like murders and crimes and things like this. Also, through the early 20th century, people would attend trials and executions for fun. This was American entertainment. So true crime and the obsession with crime is not a new thing. But I was really curious because, especially in the 19th century, there does seem to be this fascination with the female poisoner, like the Black Widow character who's always murdering her husbands. This seemed like really big kind of in these penny dreadfuls and in the memory of the time, when in fact, female murderers are such a small percentage of murderers. So a few statistics, both historical and present day. So when we're talking about murders, 90.3% today and historically of murders are committed by men. So we're really talking about outliers. Less than 10% of all murders are committed by women. Men do the killing. I don't know why. I don't know what's wrong with them. That's a topic for a different expert and another talk. That being said, when it comes specific to poisoning, the percentage of women who poison are disproportionately high. So there was one survey done between 1875 and 1880 that showed that 6.8 out of every 10 poisoners were women. So approximately 70% of all poisonings were committed by women. Today, that is a little different. These stats are from 2006 to 2010. They found that 39.5%, so we'll just say about 40% of poisoners are women. And then everything else is all other genders. Now, this is also interesting when you compare it to the fact that women, for example, only represent 7.9% of all gun murders. So when women do kill, poison is the weapon of choice. So why? Well, it's non-confrontational. You don't need physical force to murder someone in this way. And in general, women seem to be historically and today in caretaking roles, the wife, the mother, the nurse. And again, looking at statistics, when someone is being poisoned, it's often done by the caretaker. And it's usually there's a big age difference where the person doing the murdering is quite a bit younger than the person they're murdering. So there's a power imbalance in one way or another, okay? And then this obsession historically with female poisoners has to do with this idea too that women were seen as being morally superior. And so to have a woman that has killed someone, whether it be her partner or her children, that is a falling from grace that Victorians were particularly obsessed with, and to a certain extent also sexualized to this wicked, wicked woman. So we're going to talk about two cases. Actually, neither of them are American. There is a famous female poisoner from New Jersey, but her story is a real bummer. So we're going to talk about these two, which are also bummers, but slightly less. We're going to first talk about the story of Marie Cabel. Marie was from Paris, France. Both of her parents had passed away by the time she was 18 years old. And so she was adopted by an aunt. Now, and today, that doesn't make sense. Like, you're 18, you're a legal adult. That's not true historically. Women were really never legal adults. You know, they couldn't vote, they couldn't hold land except under specific circumstances. They were basically the property of their fathers until they got married, and then they were the property of their husbands. So she's living in this household that takes pretty good care of her, but also in her memoir, she said that her aunt just really made it known, like, you're not my daughter, I'm not really going to help you. She got an education, she had a dowry. It was not a very big dowry. So while she came from a rich family in high society, she was having difficulty finding a high society husband. Her uncle engages a matchmaker, and the matchmaker finds a match. The uncle doesn't want Marie to know that this is through a matchmaker, so he lies and says this guy, Charles Lafarge, is his friend. They go to the opera. Marie says he seems fine. Charles Lafarge, unfortunately, is not fine. He is from a family that was at one point wealthy, but oddly, about 50-ish years ago, Charles Lafarge's father had bought a former monastery that he tried to convert into an iron foundry, and the whole thing failed. And so now the family, Charles, his mother, their servants, some cousins, it's a little confusing, are living in this like half fallen down, crumbling foundry former monastery, and are broke. So everything that he told the matchmaker is a total lie. And it's basically because the only way that Charles thinks that he can turn around his financial missteps is by marrying really well and getting a large dowry. So without knowing this, Marie agrees to the marriage. They get married. They go into the countryside to the crumbling, non-functional iron foundry. And that's when she really realizes what's going wrong. It's said that on the first night, she locked herself in her room and passed her husband notes begging for him to annul the marriage. She threatened to take her own life. But then after that point, she seems to sort of warmed up. She was described as generally cheerful. She was making the place nice, hanging drapes or whatever you do in a half-abandoned foundry. And she even tried to win over the affections of her mother-in-law, who apparently was extremely mean. So the whole thing seems miserable, and it's tough to find out if Marie was really trying to make the best of her circumstances or what was going on. She was writing introductions to Charles to some of her rich friends in Paris so that hopefully he could get funding to reestablish his iron foundry business. And he goes on a business trip to Paris. Oh, I apologize. I haven't given you any dates to this, but this is all happening in basically in the 1840s. Like, I think she gets married 1838, December of 1838 is when he goes to Paris. She sends some love letters, and she sends him some cakes close to Christmas time and said, I'd love it if you would take a bite of one of these cakes at midnight on this particular day, and I'll do the same thing. And this sort of act of love will bring us together, even though we're physically separate. Charles finds the cakes in the package as he expected. He takes a bite at the appointed time and suddenly becomes violently ill. Now, cholera is really common at this time. Food poisoning is really common. So he just thinks that the cakes have maybe spoiled in transit and he throws them out. But about a week later, when he returns to their foundry, he's still not feeling well. And so Marie says, well, I'm going to be the nursemaid. I'll take care of him. They bring in actually two doctors to get two different opinions. And they both say, yeah, this is cholera. Make sure, hydrate, sugar water, eggnog. But one of the servants catches Marie Lafarge mixing a white powder into these drinks that she's giving to her husband. And when Marie is asked what it is, she says that it is orange flower sugar. So it's like a sugar flavored with orange flower water. Poison cake. Sorry, I get ahead of myself. The servant didn't believe it. The servant thought it was arsenic because when one of the doctors was around, Marie asked if she could get a prescription for arsenic to poison the rats that were running rampant in this half-abandoned monastery foundry. And later on, during Marie's trial, spoiler alert, the gardener does confirm that she gave him the arsenic to make into like rat poison pellets. Now, the thing is, like, you didn't have to even try that hard to get arsenic. Arsenic was really, really commonly used in the 19th century, both as an animal poison, but it is actually strangely an element, and it creates a really particular shade of green that was incredibly popular in the early and mid 19th century. Everything in this painting is arsenic green. So there was arsenic green paint, there was arsenic green wallpaper. She's wearing an arsenic green dress. I even saw a post recently from the American Antiquarian Society in Massachusetts that they went through and tested a bunch of their books for arsenic, and they came up with like half a dozen books that the covers were green and had been dyed with arsenic. You can't handle those with your bare hands, because especially when you're sweating, arsenic gets absorbed into the pores of your skin and poisons you. So yeah, you're breathing it in rooms that are painted with arsenic. But the worst was women would have silk evening dresses dyed with arsenic, and then they go to parties and dance, and the arsenic would slowly poison them, basically through their sweaty armpits, would leach the dye out of their dresses. Not only that, though, but arsenic was also a part of women's skincare, because arsenic dilates the blood vessels in your skin, and so it would give you this really snowy white complexion. So you didn't have to like go buy rat poison; you would just buy Dr. Campbell's safe arsenic complexion wafers, which is just arsenic that just splashed on your face. So there was a lot of arsenic poisoning in the 19th century, and there was a lot of arsenic around. You will probably not be surprised to know that Charles Lafarge dies. And the family is suspicious of Marie. She is eventually arrested and goes to trial. And interestingly, her trial is the first trial, it's considered the first trial to use forensics. It employed this brand new method called the Marsh test. And the Marsh test is able to test for minute quantities of arsenic in liquids. And that same servant that thought Marie was suspicious had saved one of the eggnog glasses. And so the Marsh test was performed on it, and it did test positive for arsenic. So Marie Lafarge goes to prison for 12 years. During that time, she writes her memoirs. I do think that there is an English translation that I think I've been able to find as an ebook for a couple bucks. Her French version is available for free online. On the left is the plate from inside, the portrait of her, but tons of portraits were done about her. And she looks like kind of sexy for the 1830s and 40s, you know, relax. The one on the right is an earlier one that's a very like 1830s, early 1840s dress. And the one on the left is probably a little bit later. She stays in prison for 12 years, decrying her innocence the whole time. Eventually, her sentence is commuted and she's let out in 1852, but unfortunately has tuberculosis and she passes away just a few weeks later. Now, one of the things that I think is the most fascinating about the Marie Lafarge case is that it is credited as helping to create divorce law within France. Because up until this point, like Marie Lafarge didn't really have any way to get out of her marriage. She hoped for annulment initially, but that's really, really hard to prove. A husband could get a divorce by just saying, you know, that the wife had been not faithful, but a wife would have to prove a really extreme case. And in general, the divorce was not allowed. It wasn't socially acceptable. And also it put you into an environment where you had no money or property or anything of your own. But one of the most interesting, like you might have noticed that when I gave you those statistics from the 1870s versus the early 2000s, that the poisoning rate had dropped quite a bit, from 70% to 40%. And in general, that number has been linked to the increased availability of independence and access to divorce. So if a woman can escape perhaps in this case, horrible husband, abusive husband, whatever reason, anyone should be allowed to leave the relationship for whatever reason. And when you restrict that access, some women kill people. So the more independence and freedom women have, the less men they kill. We're going to talk about one more case. This one is in Britain. And this is the case of Christina Edmonds. Sometimes she's also known as Christiana Edmonds. And I included a little book. I don't know if it's available as a physical book. It might only be an ebook, but I really enjoyed it. It's by a woman named Kay Jones, and it's called The Case of the Chocolate Cream Killer, which is how Christiana Edmonds was known. So if you want to know more about this case after we're done here, then you should definitely get this book. It's a pretty quick read and really fascinating, because her case also says something much broader about how women are treated in the 19th century, in particular, how unmarried women are treated. So we'll come back to chocolate cream. So Christiana Edmonds had a tragic childhood. I should say the main part of the story is taking place in the 1870s. So we're talking like 1850s. Her father was actually quite a successful architect, but over time, he seemed to develop some sort of mania. Again, looking back on it 150 years, it's very difficult to tell what was going on with him, but his mental state degraded over time to the point where eventually he had to be put into an asylum. The same thing also happened to one of Christiana's siblings. So by the 1870s, it was just Christiana and her mom. Luckily, the father/husband had been so successful as an architect, he had enough money invested that by the time Christiana and her mother were on their own, they had enough money they could just live off those investments. They moved around a little bit, but they settled seemingly quite happily into an apartment in the town of Brighton, which is like a beachy resort town. And Christiana developed a friendship with a man named Dr. Beard. And Dr. Beard was at first her dentist, but they really seemed to hit it off. They hung out. He would come over and visit with Christiana and her mom. And it comes out later that this is quite an improprietous relationship, because Christiana is single. She's an unmarried woman. At this point, she's in her early 40s. I'm 40, so oh no. And it is revealed later that they are constantly writing very flirtatious letters back and forth. When we get to the trial at the end, the defense there's more details in the book. Dr. Beard said, no, she's crazy. I wasn't into her at all. But there's like letters and letters and letters of them flirting back and forth. And it seemed like they probably had a physical relationship. This is an issue because Dr. Beard is married. Christiana gets it into her head that the only thing standing between her and Dr. Beard getting together and getting married themselves is Mrs. Beard, his wife. So Christiana goes to a place called Maynard's. They were high-class confectioners, as you could see, in Brighton, really famous for their chocolates, and in particular, their chocolate creams. Now, chocolate creams were not necessarily chocolate filled. The inside of a cream chocolate is whipped sugar that is then flavored with something like raspberry or vanilla or sometimes cocoa. So it's these, thanks, Jess. Yeah, take a look on the Amazon, worth it. It's just kind of a weird little book, but it's dives really deeply into all the details of this case. So chocolate creams are the ones that when I get them in the Whitman sampler are really disappointing. I'm more of a nut and caramel gal. She gets these bonbons. She injects them with strychnine. She goes over to the Beard's house when Dr. Beard is at work. She knows Mrs. Beard. She offers him some chocolates and then playfully pops one of the chocolates in her mouth. Very quickly, Mrs. Beard becomes violently ill. That's how Dr. Beard finds her when he comes home. She does survive, but she's sick for several days and tells Dr. Beard what happened. And after this incident, Dr. Beard cuts off all contact with Christiana Edmonds. Now, strychnine comes from a plant, the Strychnos nux vomica plant. Also was really commonly available both as an animal poison and as a medicine in pharmacies of the 19th century. So it was the most common rat poison, and it's a nasty poison. It makes your muscles convulse and contract, basically to the point where you suffocate because your involuntary muscles aren't working to move your lungs in and out. However, it was also the alkaloid we're talking about a lot about alkaloids. The alkaloids in strychnine is actually pretty similar to caffeine. So it was also prescribed in these peptonics with, as you can see, it's also 14% alcohol too, and then infused with strychnine. And it was really popular with students like studying all night for exams to like take strychnine pills. And this didn't really last very long because, of course, people overdosed and died. So again, much like arsenic, available commonly even outside of its use as a rat poison. We'll come back. Yeah, we'll put that up. So here's the rest of the story of Christina Edmonds. This is where she ends up ultimately, which is Broadmoor, which is an asylum in London. Still in operation, which is also very weird. So Christiana is crushed by the fact that the man that she loves and is obsessed with will no longer talk to her. So she launches a campaign to redeem herself and take blame away from herself. She goes to Maynard's, she purchases candy, the chocolate cream. She once again injects them with strychnine, and then she returns some, and others she leaves out and about in little baggies. And so people, I mean, because I guess you can just return chocolate in the 19th century, and then Maynard's restocked it, and then they resold it. And so people were coming down as ill all over the city. The little bags she would leave, kids would just pick up and start eating them. So only one person died. Unfortunately, it was a little boy of about 11 years old. So now at this point, she is officially a murderer, not just a poisoner. There is an inquest done. An inquest, basically, it's like, we'd call it maybe like a grand jury today. It's something like that. But a coroner's inquest is when the coroner interviews, looks into the reason why someone died. And Christiana is actually called to the stand because she says that she also got chocolate from Maynard's and she got really sick and she reported it and no one listened to her. And the press at this point celebrates her as like being this hero that she's coming forward. But then she still hasn't gotten her dude back. This is a line from one of their letters, Caro Mio, which is like their pet name for each other, Italian. I've been so miserable since my last letter to you. I can't go on without ever speaking to you. So her new plan is she puts together these like gift baskets with fruit and marzipan and cakes, and it's all injected with strychnine. And she sends it to a lot of people in Brighton and important people. But this time, like they're on to her. Basically, the police detective starts going around to the pharmacies because at this point in time, if you're buying a poison like arsenic or strychnine, you have to put your name in a ledger that says that you bought it. And although Christiana used a fake name, she had also written little notes to go into the poison gift baskets. And so they compared the handwriting between the signatures and the ledgers, and you have to write like the reason that you're buying strychnine with the notes, and they realize it's Christiana. Like I said, she ends up going on trial. She is convicted. I don't think Dr. Beard is totally innocent in this. He wasn't out there killing anybody, but like he clearly was having this affair with this woman. She, however, was clearly very mentally unwell, and she does spend the rest of her life, which is a long time. She dies in the early 20th century in an asylum. But the perspective at the time is that she behaved this way because she was a spinster. So she hadn't fulfilled her purpose in life as a woman. She was redundant. A single woman is considered redundant. And having this brush with the possibility of a man's love means that like it drove her insane. The interesting, Cindy reminds me of the poisoning in Chicago in 1982, where there was tampering, the victims were random. And crazily enough, Cindy, that case is still unsolved. I mean, that's why we have, childproof, the foil on all kinds of bottles now, but they still don't know who did it. Here's a press clipping about that came out after Christiana's conviction. As a spinster in her time of life, early 40s, Christiana's mind had been unhinged by her tragic love affair, and her whole obsessive conduct thereafter was typical of the demented middle-aged woman crossed in love. So at the time, it wasn't that she was mentally unwell, it was that she was single. And those are my food history horror stories. Are there any other questions? We'll go here. That's my book, by the way, is in the library. That's my social media. And I'm trying to think. Yeah, and then I'm going to be back in November to talk about pie.
Yeah, we're really excited for that one.
Yeah.
Pie is everyone's favorite subject.
Yeah.
Right.
I love getting to the holiday season. There's some good eating ahead.
Yeah. All right. So did you already see Cindy's comment here about Tylenol? That was the last thing I think that you mentioned there.
Yes. Oh, and something very random. If you all haven't seen the movie The Witch, not The Witches, the Roald Dahl one, but The Witch, a horror movie that came out 5 or 6 years ago, I would say, I'd highly recommend it. It really, going to this earlier idea of like, how does a whole town start believing that witches are real? That movie really explores the sense that in puritanical, like New England puritanical religions, it was real. God and the devil were real. Heaven and hell were real. So if you believed in that, then it was really easy to also believe there was a witch living in the woods. And it's a very, very spooky movie. I really love it. Lois, so this is from the Q&A. She did not go to prison. She went to an asylum. So they pled insanity and she was convicted, but all determined insane. And so she lived out the rest of her life at Broadmere Asylum, which was a very long life. I think she died in like the 1920s as a very, very old woman. Do I know anything about Amy Archer Gilligan from Connecticut? Dude, I can't remember the name of the really awful case from like New Jersey. And I think she also lived in Connecticut too, but I can't remember if that was her name. So I'm sorry, I don't know anything about that story. I'm glad you all think that it was fun after it's such like it's a very gothic talk, but I do find all of this stuff fascinating because it's not just about the food. It's these are very women focused stories. And one of the reasons I actually think that true crime is so popular right now, particularly with women, is because we get to reclaim these stories of violence against us, stories that have been traditionally told from a male perspective, but now we get to retell the stories and interpret it from our own perspective. So I think it's actually really empowering. Oh my God, Kathy, I did not. Kathy just asked, did I wear the arsenic green blouse on purpose? No, I just picked it out because I like to have a little pop of color on camera, but you are absolutely right. I'm totally wearing an arsenic green blouse.
That's so funny. Yeah, this is a perfect compliment to also just last week we had a speaker from the Salem Witch Museum online
Cool.
with us, and she did the history of witches. And it was the same kind of feminist movements and throughout history that have led people to discriminate against witches or promote witches as like a really interesting pop icon. So that was this just goes really so well with that. So thank you.
I mean, and we talked about at Salem that the first women accused were outsiders. I mean, feel free to refute this if the expert had any other knowledge, but when we're talking about medieval Europe, the women that would get accused were often like midwives or medical professionals. And again, often, but not always, unmarried women. So it was a way to target women that were independent, essentially.
Yeah, I think she touched on that. She also touched on the idea that the witch trials really, the persecution of witches and the murdering of women that were accused of witchcraft happened in areas where there wasn't really great central authority in medieval Europe. So it would happen in like the Germany and northern Italy and like Scotland, places where people could pretty much make up their own roles and people just went into hysterics.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this was a fascinating talk though. I really actually didn't know that about the way that women commit murder, that poisoning is there. I never made that connection before, so that was really interesting.
Yeah, that is the women's weapon of choice. Again, considering that women are only doing 10% of the murdering too. So that is always an interesting statistic to think about. So there you have it.
Like Arsenic and Old Lace,
Yes.
that classic movie with Cary Grant. That was
And I
great.
should say that although arsenic and strychnine are still used as animal poisons today, they're required by law to have dyes added to them and also substances that will like make them appear sort of greasy. So like if you added any of these to a liquid today, it would like turn teal and look greasy, like it would look odd. So this does occasionally still come up in contemporary court cases, but usually doesn't result in a poisoning because it's by law, you have to make it visible so that you can tell that something a lot. Yeah, Agatha Christie knew a lot about poisons. I recently listened to her first book as an audiobook. Oh no, it was the first appearance of Poirot, so it wasn't her very first one. And it's this whole mystery about how this woman was killed, how was she killed? And it ended up there was a mention of that she took a cup of hot chocolate to bed. Different styles, yes. And from the beginning of the book, I was like, ooh, it's arsenic poisoning. Because one of the things about arsenic is that it actually tastes sweet. So you mix it in with a sweet beverage like hot chocolate. So there you have it. Now you
Oh,
know.
yeah.
You'll be able to
Cindy was
solve all
asking
your. Go ahead.
about Julius Caesar. Was Julius Caesar poisoned?
Stabbed at
I think it was,
Tubrute,
yeah, the very famous scene, Et tu, Brute.
but maybe poison daggers. Cindy, that's just outside of my wheelhouse. I'm sorry.
What is
We'll
it?
give it a Google. It's outside of my wheelhouse.
Oh, no, that's okay. I think I think it was Socrates that drank was the old, I don't know, there was a I can't remember what, hemlock.
Hemlock.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much, Sarah. That was wonderful. As always, there's lots of great comments in the chat here, and I will send out this recording to everyone tomorrow, and we'll see you again on the 17th.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. See you again soon.
Good night, everyone.